Welcome to the Bipolar Buzz podcast, where we slice stigma surrounding mental illness one episode at a time, and we give others courage to do the same. I am your host, Lay, a wife, mom, daughter, sister, coworker, and friend who also lives with bipolar 1 disorder. So, without further ado, let's slay. In this episode of the Bipolar Buzz podcast, I'll be discussing gender differences and biases with respect to the diagnosis of depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder. So before we kick off the conversation, which is going to be me giving you some facts and also some of my personal thoughts and just some things for you to think about just to get your wheels turning about why some of these differences might exist, here are the facts that I'm going to sort of base this discussion off of. One, women are twice as likely as men to be diagnosed with depression. 2, women are twice as likely as men to be diagnosed with anxiety, which is highly comorbid with depression. And some of the research indicates that this could be biological or hormonal differences between men and women, and that's why women are more likely than men to be diagnosed with these disorders or neurochemical differences between men and women. But there's also this school of thought, I'll call it, that kind of points to social factors like socioeconomic status, and even goes so far as to say that race and sexuality can also contribute to one's diagnosis of these mental health issues. But also I think that societal expectations and norms also contribute to maybe the higher rate of women being diagnosed than men. So for instance, women kind of have these domestic responsibilities that are expected of them, and they have to take care of, everybody else, and sometimes they neglect themselves. So that could be one possible reason. And then men are kind of trained, quote unquote, to be stoic and not show emotion and not let things get to them. So that could also be another reason for why the prevalence rate of depression and anxiety is higher in women than men. So this kind of leads to this idea of internalizing versus externalizing behaviors. So internalizing are more commonly seen in women. So these are things like social withdrawal or feeling sad or feeling fearful, versus externalizing, which we see more often in the male population. These exhibit themselves as aggression or impulsivity or inattention. So I found it interesting that, women are twice as likely than men to be diagnosed with depression and anxiety. However, women and men are equally likely to be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but the initial depressive episode occurs about 5 years sooner in men than in women. And also, women are more likely to be diagnosed with bipolar 2 disorder compared to men. And that's interesting because one of the differences between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 disorder is that in bipolar 1 disorder, according to the newest edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, bipolar 1 disorder, you don't necessarily have to experience a depressive episode to get that diagnosis. But with bipolar 2 disorder, you do have to experience a depressive episode. So I wonder, if that's why the bipolar 2 diagnosis is more commonly seen in women, because of that depressive episode, the depressive component to it, which we've already discussed, could be linked to biological differences, could be linked to social factors or societal expectations and norms. So misdiagnosis kind of comes up in this discussion too, because, if men are really less likely to have depression, they have higher rates of unaliving themselves than women do. And although women do have higher rates of the ideation to unalive themselves, but it just makes me wonder if it's really a diagnostic issue or if it's more so biases that are contributing to the higher rates of diagnosis in women versus men, and these gender stereotypes that we kind of have associated with each gender. And when I say biases, I'm referring to diagnostic accuracy. So that's meaning that the diagnoses that are given to one group of people are more accurate than the diagnoses given to another group of people. So for example, that could be more accurate for women versus men, more accurate for whites versus blacks, and so on and so forth. And there's three types of biases that I wanted to briefly discuss. And the first is clinician bias, and this has to do with the person giving the diagnosis. Are they culturally competent? So does this person know how depression or anxiety or bipolar presents across races, or how it presents between men and women, so on and so forth. There's also assessment bias, and this goes into kind of the validity of psychological testing for both internal and external validity. So internal refers to the design of the test, the administration of the test, the analysis. Is it actually answering the research question? And then when you talk about external validity, you're referring to how generalizable your results are to a given population. And then there's also criteria bias. So I kind of touched on this when I talked about gender stereotypes, but this is something that I am calling gendered symptomatology. So basically, certain symptoms are more often associated with women than with men, and vice versa. And if some of these symptoms are showing up on these assessments and others are not, you might miss this whole group of people who are feeling depressed, but your instrument or your test, your assessment has not been designed in such a way as to capture those people who might also be exhibiting symptoms of depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder. I think that in the grand scheme of things, that the likelihood that men and women may exhibit this disorder differently is very high. So I just wanted to kind of throw these facts out there and give you some things to think about. So is it really that women are more likely to be depressed, and that's why the diagnosis of women is higher than men when it comes to depression and anxiety? Or is it just the fact that we're missing something? We're not capturing what depression looks like for men versus women.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Bipolar Buzz podcast, where we have the courage to slay stigma. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe for more and share with a friend.